Imagine an ordinary day in a hairdresser's shop. People are sitting in their chairs, enjoying the moment, discussing everyday topics, when suddenly the calm is broken by a loud scream. Tension hangs in the air, and all eyes look in the direction from where the noise comes. The aggressive man stands up abruptly and, unable to contain his hatred, heads toward the young black girl. He grabs her shoulder, yells something insulting, and no one could believe it strikes her. For a second, it becomes so quiet that you can hear the beating of a heart. Friends, how do you think this story will end? Write in the comments where you're watching us from, and what your name is. Your support is incredibly important to us. Every comment, every like helps grow our channel and help us tell such powerful and meaningful stories. Know that we appreciate you, and it's you who inspire us to make videos like this. Stay tuned to the end, as it's going to get even more exciting next. Enjoy the show. The morning in the small hairdresser shop, style and countenance started as usual. Customers came in leisurely to get their haircut, styled, or just to freshen up before the work week. The familiar smell of shampoo and hairspray was in the air, and the background music playing from the speakers created a calm and relaxed atmosphere. A young woman named Monica sat in a chair by the window. Her dark hair was neatly styled, and her gaze was fixed on the mirror opposite. She was listening to the stylist, who was putting the finishing touches to her new haircut. Monica was a regular at the hair salon, and everyone here knew her. Her open smile and quiet friendliness attracted people, and the staff was always happy to greet her. Monica was also well liked by a master named Lisa, a blonde woman in her 30s, who acted as if she could hold a conversation with any customer. Nothing seemed to disturb the morning peace until a tall man walked through the door. His name was Victor, and his presence instantly changed the atmosphere in the barbershop. Victor was a new customer, but his demeanor was so gruff and self-assured that it caused unease among those around him. He looked to be about 40 years old, and he clearly felt his superiority, as if everyone around him had to give way to him. His gaze glided around the room with slight contempt, and he immediately chose a chair in the corner from which he could watch everyone. At first, no one paid any attention to Victor. The hairdressers continued to work, the customers to discuss their daily business. But as soon as he noticed Monica, his expression changed. He looked at her with a long, unpleasant stare that made him uncomfortable. Victor sat in the chair, his posture tense, as if he were preparing for a fight. His every gesture, every movement was like a warning to those around him. He was not going to have friendly conversations with anyone. His stern features and slightly furrowed eyebrows spoke of a man accustomed to carrying hidden anger and irritation. His eyes, sharp and cold, seemed to cling to imperfections, picking up the slightest signs of what he thought was wrong. Victor looked like an ordinary man, but there was something disturbing, even frightening, in his gaze. Perhaps he had once been different, younger, lighter, more cheerful, but the events of life had left a heavy imprint on him. Victor's childhood was spent in a poor neighborhood, where he learned early on that respect must be earned by force. His father was a tough and aggressive man, often raising his son through yelling and physical punishment. Victor saw both cruelty and injustice, qualities that were deeply embedded in his character, becoming something habitual and, over time, justified in his eyes. These childhood traumas caused Victor to withdraw into himself. His inner world became an arena for many unresolved conflicts. It seemed to him that everyone around him was against him, and he had to be on guard against imaginary enemies. Over time, he began to attribute his own complexes and prejudices to others, seeing in others what irritated him in himself. Failures in relationships, conflicts with superiors, a constant feeling of dissatisfaction with life, all this made Victor a person who saw only those who hindered him. He became hostile to people, especially those who were different from him, or who violated his ideas of how things should be. This racism and hatred, which once existed as vague ideas, became an integral part of his worldview. Now he did not hide his attitude, and sometimes he even looked for reasons to show his hatred, as if to confirm his superiority over those he considered strangers. His aggression was a way for him to cope with his inner pain and insecurity. Though he would never admit it, perhaps Victor should have gone to a specialist to deal with his past. But in his world, that was a sign of weakness, and Victor could not afford to be weak. Victor, looking around the barbershop, suddenly noticed Monica. His face immediately contorted, as if he had seen something unpleasant. His gaze became intense, penetrating, filled with contempt. He kept his eyes on her, as if she were a stranger who had mistakenly entered his own space. Monica, laughing at something Lisa had said, didn't notice his gaze, but that only fueled his anger more. It seemed unacceptable to him that someone he considered different should be so relaxed and content. Victor grew up with stereotypes that for years fueled his hatred of anyone who differed from him in appearance and culture. To him, black people were outsiders he didn't want to deal with or be around. Contempt for them became part of his identity. As bleak as that sounds, Victor didn't just believe in his superiority, he found a kind of cruel pride in it that comforted his own complexes and feelings. Inside him was rage mixed with contempt, which he made no attempt to hide. With his head tilted slightly to the side, he scrutinized Monica from head to toe, drawing conclusions based on his prejudiced and racist worldview. She seemed to him too confident, too free and happy. All that his inner world, built on hatred and suspicion, could not accept. Victor felt irritation and anger literally rising from within, like a bitter wave that was about to overwhelm him. He wanted to destroy this calmness, this confidence, which, as it seemed to him, were undeserved. He saw her smile, her equanimity, as a challenge, and it made him angry to the point of shivering. It didn't occur to him that Monica had simply come to the barbershop like any other person. It was a matter of principle to him. He couldn't stand to have her around. As he came closer, he didn't even try to hide his dislike. It was as if it reflected all his inner resentment, and he felt the need to suppress it, to rob her of that confidence. Victor leaned closer, still glaring at her, and something dark, subtle, but ominous flashed in his eyes. Victor stepped closer to Monica, his face frowning in an expression of cold contempt. He squinted his eyes, as if weighing each word, and leaning toward the girl, he said the offending phrase in a barely audible, almost whispered voice. His voice was harsh, filled with hidden menace, and though he did not raise his tone, everyone around him frowned, sensing the tension. Monica, who had been calm until then, suddenly turned pale. His words hurt her, not so much the words themselves, but Victor's intention to make her feel alien and humiliated in her usual place. Victor stared at her intently, hoping to see fear or confusion on her face, but instead her gaze hardened. Monica was clearly not going to stay silent or give in to pressure, and her determination only made Victor angrier. At that moment, the attention of all the customers and staff in the barbershop was fixed on them. An awkward silence filled the room. Everyone seemed to feel the tension that was building with every moment. Master Lisa stopped in motion, ready to intervene, but at the same moment frowned, waiting to see how events would unfold next. Gathering her courage, Monica looked Victor straight in the eye. Her calmness confused him. He hadn't expected such a reaction, as if reading the challenge in her gaze. Victor realized that this girl was not going to give in or accept his behavior. Monica took a deep breath, trying not to show how much Victor's words hurt her. Her first inclination was to respond, but she knew that would only fuel his aggression. Instead, she shifted her gaze back to Lisa, who frowned, holding the scissors in her hands in confusion, and tried to return to the interrupted conversation as if nothing had happened. Having gathered her courage, Monica quietly asked Lisa how best to style her hair, as if she was not interrupted by someone else's gaze full of contempt. She smiled, trying to keep the conversation going, feeling Victor's gaze on her, but her hands trembled involuntarily, and her gaze kept returning to the mirror, where Victor's image was reflected, his face distorted with anger, and his eyes burning with coldness, which never left her. Her attempt to ignore him was a challenge. Monica realized that if she showed him her discomfort and pain, he would feel his victory. She tried to concentrate on her conversation with Lisa, but Victor's words echoed in her head, leaving behind an unpleasant residue. It wasn't the first time she'd had to deal with such an attitude, but each time it hurt, wounding somewhere deep inside. Lisa noticed her attempt to return to the conversation and tried to play along to support her and distract her from the unpleasant situation. She kept talking about her hair, about how it would emphasize Monica's facial features, but Lisa could feel the tension hanging in the air, and Victor's gaze, which was still glittering with hatred. Victor felt the rage bubbling up inside him like a volcano ready to erupt. His efforts to humiliate Monica had failed. She continued to ignore his provocations, and that only added fuel to the fire. Anger mixed with powerlessness swept over him. He hated the way she remained calm, as if she was unaffected by his words. This feeling of powerlessness was unbearable. "Listen, you don't think I'm going to let you just sit here like you're somebody," he shouted, his voice resonating through the walls of the barbershop, making everyone present wince. Victor didn't realize how his aggression was changing the atmosphere in the room. He had only one goal: to break this girl's confidence and show that he was in charge. But every shout, every derogatory comment only increased his own despair. Monica felt a wave of fear rising inside her. She frowned in surprise like everyone else, but quickly collected herself, forcing her heartbeat to slow. Her mind was running on edge, and she knew she couldn't show weakness. She didn't want to look vulnerable in front of Victor, but his rage was overwhelming. Monica felt her hands grow cold and her throat constrict with tension. Why is he so aggressive? She thought, hiding her fear behind a mask of calm. Thoughts flashed through her mind about how important it was to maintain her dignity, even when those around her were trying to destroy it. She tried to ignore his words, but each one left a mark, reminding her of how different she was. It wasn't just an insult, it was a blow to her identity, to her dignity. Finally, gathering her thoughts, she turned her head toward Victor, ready to meet his gaze, determined not to give in. Monica knew she had to show that she could not be intimidated. Inner courage was her shield in this conflict, and she was willing to fight for her right to be in this place, no matter what. Victor, seized with furious anger, could not stop. His words, full of rage and prejudice, sounded like screams bursting from the depths of his hatred. He knew that his racist comments would not only humiliate Monica, but also undermine her confidence, and that gave him even more strength. Every jab, every word full of contempt became a way for him to quench his inner rage. "You think your skin is something special," he reprimanded, pointing at her skin like it was a curse. "This is no place for the likes of you. You and yours are prying as usual." His voice grew louder and louder, as if he was flirting with the reactions of those around him. Wanting his hatred to be noticed, the words rained down like sharp stones, tearing the atmosphere of the barbershop, leaving scars behind. Monica felt the tension building in her heart, but a new strength was building inside her. She realized that his words were not only an attack on her as a person, but also a reflection of his own fears and complexes. Victor was the embodiment of hatred cultivated over the years, and his aggression was merely a projection of his inner demons. "How dare you even open your mouth?" he continued, angry that she wasn't reacting the way he expected. "You don't have the brains to realize that you have no right to be here. People like you only ruin everything." He relished his power. His words went beyond the usual anger. It was hatred based on stereotypes, prejudice, and profound ignorance. As Monica listened to him, she felt this torrent of hatred becoming unbearable, but she wasn't going to give up. His attempts to humiliate her only strengthened her resolve. She knew that his words were meaningless and based on fear of losing control, fear of what he couldn't understand. Victor was unable to see that his hatred, like his aggression, only reflected his own weakness. He sought strength by putting others in a demeaning light, believing it would make him stronger, but in reality, it only emphasized his inner emptiness and insecurity. Every reproach he hurled at Monica was a form of self-destruction that would eventually turn against him. Victor's words hung in the air like lightning tearing the sky during a thunderstorm. The hair salon, style and comfort, frenzy and anticipation. Customers and employees were trapped in misunderstanding. For many, it was something incredible, a moment they could not have imagined. How could this happen in an ordinary place where people come for simple pleasures? The customers sitting in the chairs frowned, unable to take their eyes off what was happening. Some looked at each other, trying to figure out whether to intervene, while others, full of bewilderment, just watched the scene unfold before their eyes. The gaze of some of the girls waiting their turn was full of shock. They couldn't believe that someone could display hatred so openly. The man in the corner, who had been reading a magazine a few minutes ago, now put it aside and tensed up, as if preparing to stand up and intervene, but hesitated for fear of making the situation worse. Lisa, Monica's master, felt helpless. Her hands were shaking and she had a hard time making a decision. She didn't know the best course of action in this situation, to intervene or to call the police. She felt the need to protect Monica, but as an experienced stylist, she realized that any move could have unpredictable consequences. Lisa watched Monica, her heart pounding, but she saw that the girl was confident, and that gave her strength. Through the noise and tension in the barbershop came discreet whispers. "Did he really say that?" Several women whispered among themselves. They couldn't understand how someone could get to this point. "Why doesn't anyone do anything?" whispered one of the customers, and her voice was full of fear and confusion. They were shocked at what was happening and at the same time felt powerless. Victor's unexpected aggression threw everyone into confusion, and in that moment, there was not only tension in the air, but also a sense of shame that they were just watching. It was difficult for each of them to realize that this behavior could exist in their community. Some clients thought about how they could support Monica, but for a moment each of them was trapped in their own thoughts, and they didn't know the right thing to do. This situation exacerbated the general discontent, fueling internal conflicts that each of them may have been hiding within themselves. Complex thoughts about racism, about injustice, about the right to defense came over them like a mountain, and they did not know how to unload it. There was confusion in their eyes, but none of them had the courage to say what each of them was thinking. There was a suffocating silence in the barbershop that seemed to press down on my chest. Every heart beat in unison with anxiety, and time seemed to lengthen, becoming unbearable. The sounds of blow dryers, haircuts, and animated conversations faded away, leaving only mounting tension and confusion. Customers and staff frowned in their seats, exchanging looks of fear and bewilderment, as if each of them was in a state of shock, not knowing how to react. As if waiting for a hurricane, the tension was building with every passing moment. Victor, feeling that his words had resonated, had no intention of stopping. He stood there with a furious expression on his face, like a predator ready to strike again. Monica, though she tried to remain calm, could feel her blood pounding in her temples and her breathing becoming more labored. Her inner world was falling apart as Victor continued to spew his hatred, but outwardly she remained strong. Some of the clients looked over at each other, their eyes searching for support, as if hoping that one of them would decide to intervene. But inside everyone, the mature decision was faced with uncertainty. What if he responds with aggression? A thought and fear paralyzed their actions. Many might have wanted to stand up and support Monica, but fear of the possible consequences kept them in place. Lisa, standing behind the chair, felt her body fill with tension. Her professional instincts told her that she should intervene, but she also realized that situations like this could easily get out of control. She noticed how her co-workers frowned as well, all ready for action, but no one stepped forward. This moment, when everyone realized that something had to be done, but no one could find the strength to do it, became truly ominous. At this point, one of the customers, trying to break the silence, said quietly, "Is this really happening?" The phrase hung in the air, and the other clients looked around as if returning to reality. But instead of rallying, they fell back into silence, each looking for excuses for their inaction. Suddenly, there was a sound in the hall that broke the silence. It was a thud. When Victor, displeased with the reaction of those around him, hit the table in his heart, causing a slight tremor, that gesture signaled the moment the entire atmosphere changed. The awkward silence that had enveloped the barbershop was preparing to turn into a storm, and everyone present realized that they must either intervene or let this moment leave unhealing scars on their souls. The tension in the air became almost palpable. Everyone in the barbershop frowned, holding their breath. Victor, unable to restrain his anger, suddenly decided to open violence. His hand, clenched into a fist, rose up and then came down sharply, aiming at Monica's shoulder. The gesture was full of rage and contempt, as if he were trying to show that he had power and control in this situation. When his hand struck her shoulder, Monica felt the cold metal of fear run through her body. The blow was sudden and strong, as if it wasn't just a physical attack, but an attempt to break her spirit. At the moment of contact, she felt a sharp pain that pierced through her, making her heart beat faster. But even more than the physical pain, a feeling of rage and incomprehension gripped her. Why could someone be so ruthlessly aggressive? Victor, feeling his gesture become a real threat, held his breath for a moment, but then his face contorted with anger again. It seemed to him that by striking, he had confirmed his power, made everyone freeze in fear. This was his reward for bullying. He enjoyed the sense of dominance this act of violence gave him. But instead of breaking down, Monica instantly gathered all her inner strength. The blow made her realize that this situation didn't have to end in humiliation. She took a step back, clenching her fists, but there was no fear in her eyes, only determination. Monica knew she couldn't let Victor win. That this moment was not just an attack on her body, but on her dignity. No matter how much her shoulder hurt from the blow, a flame flared up inside her. In that moment, She realized that her fight went beyond her personal safety. It was a fight for all those who had ever faced hatred and aggression. Her anger was not directed at Victor as a person. It was directed at the entire society that allowed this to happen. The customers in the hair salon finally began to realize what was happening. Shock, confusion, and fear began to turn into a desire to act. As if the curse had been lifted, someone in the crowd whispered, "Enough." And that word was the signal not just for Monica, but for everyone who witnessed this act of violence. In that moment, the barbershop could have become an arena, where each of them chose which path to take, to stand aside or to support the girl who, despite the pain, stood up for her dignity. Victor's blow made Monica feel a sharp pain, but the physical impact was only the tip of the iceberg. Deep inside her, a real storm of emotions was unfolding, contradicting what she was trying to show to those around her. The moment his hand touched her shoulder, a wave of anger and humiliation washed over her. She tried to remain steadfast, but like any human being, she was unprotected in this emotional chaos. Monica's face changed, her lips trembled, and she felt her heart clench with depression. A battle was raging inside her. On the one hand, the urge to burst into tears, to let out all her emotions, and on the other, the need to maintain her dignity and not show weakness. Her thoughts fluttered around in her head like birds in a cage. Why me? Why is it treating me this way? These questions tormented her, making her feel lonely and vulnerable. Tears began to gather at the edges of her eyes, but Monica forced herself to hold back. She clenched her fists and lifted her chin, as if the gesture would give her more strength. She didn't want Victor to see her weakness, didn't want to be the object of his ridicule. Monica realized that if she let the tears flow, it would be like giving up, and she wasn't ready for that. Despite her best efforts, resentment and humiliation overwhelmed her. Her shoulder where he had struck her was burning with pain, but her soul was suffering even more. The tears were her inner cry for help, for understanding, for acceptance. She wasn't just fighting a physical blow, she was confronting the prejudice that had oppressed her all her life. Monica realized that her worries went beyond this one incident. She thought about how many times she had faced racism and hatred, how many times she had had to hide her feelings so as not to appear weak in the eyes of others. Those tears were not just a sign of fear, they symbolized all the pain and insecurity she had accumulated over the years. At that moment, her eyes, full of tears, met the mirror. She saw a reflection she did not want to see, a girl fighting for her identity and dignity in a world full of hatred. This realization spurred her on again, and a flame of determination ignited inside her. Monica realized that she had to fight not only for herself, but for all those in a similar situation. She couldn't let tears become her weakness. It was the beginning of her strength. As the air in the barber shop filled with tension, the people who had initially stayed away began to move closer, as if unconsciously seeking to be part of the event that was unfolding before their eyes. The crowd gathered around, and their eyes darted between Monica and Victor, as if they were searching for an explanation of what had happened and how they could help without escalating the situation. The clients, previously shocked, now had mixed feelings, ranging from anger to confusion. Some were perplexed as to how such behavior could be allowed to go unchecked. "Why doesn't anyone intervene?" thought one woman, her heart pounding with excitement. She felt she had to do something, but her indecision kept her in place. The man who was sitting in the corner reading a magazine looked up and saw Victor continuing his aggression. His thoughts instantly changed. He remembered his own experiences when he witnessed such behavior himself. He felt ashamed of his inertness. Am I really just going to watch again? The questions tormented him, and he suddenly realized that he could not remain indifferent. Lisa, the hairdresser who had been watching the situation with confusion, felt the urge build up in her to protect her client. She realized that her job was not only to cut and style, but also to create a safe space for everyone who came to her salon. The thoughts swirling in her head were, I can't let this happen. Monica deserves to be protected. This sentiment transformed her indecision into a willingness to act. There was quiet discussion among the gathering crowd. What a horror. This is simply unacceptable, one of the girls whispered, and her words were echoed by others. Many began exchanging glances, as if seeking support from each other. We can't stand by, the whispers repeated. However, fear of the possible consequences still constrained their actions. Some, especially those who had experienced similar situations in the past, realized that Victor's actions were not just his personal problems, but a reflection of a broader problem in society. This is not just a random incident, one of the men thought. This is a sign of how racism and hatred permeate our daily lives. This realization awakened a desire to speak out against hate, but again uncertainty arose. The crowd gathered around them vacillated between fear and willingness to act. Everyone who came closer felt the need to make a decision, to intervene or to stand aside. Looking at Monica, who, despite her tears, remained steadfast, they realized that this moment mattered. It was not just a scene from life, it was a moment when they could choose what position to take in the fight against hatred and prejudice. The excitement that had gripped the barbershop reached its peak when Monica finally pulled herself together. Despite her shock and depression, she felt a powerful torrent of determination building up inside her. Every insult to Victor, every humiliation became not just an attack on her personality, but a challenge she could no longer remain silent to. Monica straightened, her heart pounding, but now it was not from fear, but from anger and determination. She looked directly into Victor's eyes, and there was a fire in her gaze that was impossible to ignore. Folding her arms across her chest, she felt her strength grow and realized it was time to defend herself and anyone else who had ever faced such hatred. "You think your hatred makes you stronger," she began, her voice full of confidence, though a storm of emotion still raged inside. Every sound of her voice was like a feast that shattered the silence that enveloped her. She spoke not only for herself, but for anyone who had ever felt humiliated and abused. "I won't let you control my feelings. You don't know what power is if you let yourself talk like that." The crowd frowned, their ears catching every word. Monica continued, "You may think your words carry weight, but in truth they only reflect your own weakness. I am proud of who I am, and nothing can change that." There was rage in her voice, but it was a rage aimed at liberation, not destruction. Monica took a step forward, as if she wanted to physically mark her position, and her voice grew louder, filling the space. "I will not stand by while you try to break my dignity. I'm a human being, and like anyone else, I deserve respect, regardless of the color of my skin." She felt the confidence building in her, and it energized her, making her voice sound more and more powerful. Instantly, something changed in the atmosphere. Customers and employees who had previously held back their emotions began to show their support. Some of them quietly applauded, others nodded in approval. Monica could feel the crowd beginning to unite with her, turning her struggle into a shared one. This support gave her strength, and she realized that she was not alone in this battle. Her words, filled with determination and dignity, were not just a response to Victor's insults, it was a declaration that she would not give up. It was her first rebuff, showing that hate cannot win if someone dares to stand up and defend themselves. This moment was the starting point for Monica to not only stand up for what was right, but to inspire others to act in response to injustice. When Monica raised her voice, her words rang like a thunderclap in the silence. It wasn't just an expression of anger, but a powerful statement of her dignity and right to respect. Every word she uttered was spoken with a confidence that made even Victor freeze in surprise for a moment. There was no doubt in her voice, only a firmness that gave her words incredible power. "You, Victor," she began, and her voice was like steel hardened by fire. "Think you can control and humiliate people just because of the color of their skin. But you're wrong." She emphasized his name, as if it were a reminder that it wasn't just a faceless aggressor, but a man whose actions had consequences. The crowd gathered around, listening to her every word, felt their own hearts beating in unison with her determination. Monica continued, "Your words don't make you stronger, they only emphasize your insecurities and your own complexes. You can try to break me, but you can't take away what I am." Her voice rose, gaining new heights, each word sounding like a mantra that cast shadows of fear. "I will not let you dictate who I am or how I should feel. I am proud of my identity, proud to be a black woman, and it will never be a cause of fear or shame for me." With each word, her confidence grew, and everyone around her began to realize that they had become part of something bigger. The scene became a manifestation of strength, spirit, and unity. The people in the barbershop began to exchange glances, and in their eyes there was a look of support, a willingness to take her side. Each of them felt that this fight was not just about Monica, but about everyone who had ever faced bias. "You can't silence me," she shouted, and her words rushed out like lava, filling the space. I am here to stand up for myself, and for all those who also face aggression and hatred. The determination in her voice shook the walls of the barbershop, creating an atmosphere of unity and solidarity. In the moment, Monica realized that she was not just responding to insults, she was making all others feel heard. Her voice became a symbol of confrontation, lifting up all those around her who were also suffering from humiliation and racism. This momentary shift from victim to fighter inspired not only her, but everyone else who was there, encouraging them to take action. Like a loud siren, her voice rang in the ears of all who listened, inspiring hope and change. Monica knew that even though Victor was one step away from an answer, she'd already won. She had turned her pain into strength, and let those around her know that in the fight against hate, there would always be room for those who were willing to stand up and speak out. When Monica said her words, time seemed to stand still. There was a tense silence in the barbershop that seemed to stop the breath of the whole world. The people in the room frowned, as if holding back their shock, and their eyes fixed on Victor, who clearly hadn't expected such resistance. He stood there with his mouth open, unable to realize what was happening. A wave of confusion was rising inside him, and the confidence with which he'd approached Monica was rapidly dissipating. This moment came as a real shock to him instead of breaking her down. He was faced with a vivid, powerful response that exploded his expectations. Victor was used to being the aggressor. He was the one who suppressed, humiliated, and spread fear, and in his mind, a scenario like this was unthinkable. He hadn't expected his victim to be more than silent and patient. He couldn't imagine her standing up and expressing her feelings with such force and conviction. Her every scream undermined his idea of the power he thought he was entitled to. The crowd that had gathered was an unexpected factor for him. He couldn't ignore what was happening around him. People began to support Monica, and that only made him feel worse. Thoughts swirled in Victor's head. What's going on? Why are they on her side? How could she stand up to me like this? He was uncomfortable, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but in that anger was beginning to show worry. The seconds dragged on for what seemed like an eternity, and he realized he couldn't find the words. He remembered how easily he'd been able to intimidate people in the past, and now he felt vulnerable and weak. Panic was building inside him. He didn't know how to react to such an unexpected reaction. It was completely unthinkable in his mind. The man who had always had the upper hand was suddenly trapped in his own preconceived beliefs. There was such silence in the room that you could hear his heart beating. He tried to find the words to bring the situation back under control, but the voice that had always seemed so menacing was gone. Victor not only hadn't expected resistance, he hadn't been prepared for the fact that Monica could become a symbol of strength and struggle. He, as a man who hoped he could dictate the rules of the game, found himself in a moment that completely turned his world upside down. It was a revelation to him. Hatred and aggression do not always bring the desired results. His eyes began to show signs of confusion and fear, and in that moment, he realized that his so-called power might be just an illusion. His worries became part of the shock as he realized that he had no advantage or power in this confrontation. The silence of the hall intensified his inner torment, and he realized that this situation, which he had once considered a game, had now become a real struggle where the stakes were something greater than he had ever anticipated. Through the silence Monica had created, Victor's rage suddenly burst through. He couldn't afford to look weak, and his anger, like a threat, burst out with renewed vigor. Fury glittered in his eyes, and he began to flare his aggression more vividly as he tried to regain control of the situation. "You're just trying to seem important," he shouted, his voice sounding like the cracking of a breaking branch. "You think you can say things like that to me and go unpunished? You just don't amount to anything." The words were like poison that he sought to inject into the atmosphere, hoping to provoke Monica further. He felt bitterness and fear come over him, and it poured out in an attempt to humiliate her, hoping that such words would break her confidence. "How dare you speak to me like that? Who are you anyway?" His tone was full of contempt, as if he was trying to push her back to where he thought she should be. Every word he said was designed to hurt her, and every time he opened his mouth, his voice grew louder and more aggressive. "You think your skin color makes you special? You're just another lowly girl," he continued, raising his voice to a shout. His anger was so intense, it seemed ready to explode. But unlike him, Monica stood like a rock, unmoving and confident, Every step she took was full of strength, and her inner fire was only fueled by his words. She wasn't going to let him break her. In this confrontation, she found a support and confidence that lifted her above his humiliation. Victor, not realizing that his attempts to stir up conflict were only highlighting his own vulnerability, continued to build up the pressure. Why don't you even try to be like everyone else? If you were normal, you wouldn't have to act like this. The lunging contempt in his words was like a cold shower, but he didn't notice that instead of breaking her down, he was only further fueling her resilience. The gathered crowd, which had already begun to support Monica, felt the tension building. Their gazes moved between her and Victor with genuine interest, waiting to see how she would respond to this new attack. Each new attack was another opportunity for her to show her strength, her determination, and her resilience. Inside Victor, fear masquerading as aggression was beginning to manifest itself. His attempts to hurt Monica not only escalated the conflict, but also opened a tearing veil over his own insecurity before his eyes. He continued to pound his plate, not even realizing that he was losing himself in this confrontation. His aggression, though it looked intimidating, actually reflected his own fears and insecurities, and that gave Monica even more power. She watched him with the realization that his attacks came not from strength but from fear. And in that moment, she realized that he was in fact the one who was afraid. This conclusion only made her more eager to fight and defend herself, and every breath she took was filled with determination to continue this fight until it ended in ultimate victory. Monica stood in the center of the hair salon, her heart pounding as if it were climbing to the top of a mountain, ready to burst into a storm. Every shout from Victor, every humiliating word he'd uttered, only made her want not just to respond, but to show that she wasn't afraid. She knew it was time to show her courage for real, and her resolve lit up like a torch ready to illuminate the darkness. Gathering her thoughts, she looked Victor in the eye, and there was a steadiness in her gaze, but also a strength that he didn't seem to notice. "You want to know who I am?" she began, her voice becoming powerful, resonating in the air like a hammer blow. "I'm not just a black girl for you to insult, and I'm not going to let you demean me or my worth." The crowd around them frowned, as if time had stopped. She continued, her words penetrating the hearts of the people. "I am a woman, proud of my identity, and your words cannot break me. You can try to bully me, but all you do is show how weak you are. Weak because you need to humiliate others to feel important." Her voice grew more and more confident, and she stepped forward, refusing to retreat. "I know my worth, and I won't let you or anyone else deny it. You have no right to define who I am, and I'm not going to hide or remain silent because of your fears." There was genuine power in her words, filling the space around her. Monica felt support coming to her. People began to whisper, and a few nodded in approval. Her confidence inspired others, and she realized that she was not only standing up for herself, but for all those who had ever faced bias and hate. "I'm not going to put up with your hatred anymore," she continued, raising her head even higher. "I'm here to show you that love and respect are far more powerful than your aggression. I choose light over darkness, and I know there are people around me willing to support me." She looked around the crowd, and their faces were a reflection of her confidence. Victor, watching this scene, began to feel his own words losing force. He hadn't expected such a backlash. Monica, who had become a symbol of strength, had turned the situation in his favor, and it stirred in him a feeling of powerlessness. "You can't break me," she assured Victor, and her voice was like a sword breaking the invisible bonds of fear. "I will fight for my right to be me and for those who need support. Your hatred is but a reflection of your insecurity. I choose to stand here, and you can't stop me." With each word, her confidence grew, and she realized that this was her strength. She was not only defending her dignity, but also inspiring everyone around her. Her courage was the spark that could ignite the fire of resistance. At that moment, as she looked into Victor's eyes, she realized that her words were not just a response to his aggression, but a true declaration of her right to be herself. The crowd in the barbershop, previously silent, was now filled with admiration and support. Monica knew that this battle was just beginning, and despite Victor's threats, she was ready to keep fighting for herself and for all those who were under the grip of hatred. Her courage was the key to victory, and she was going to use it to the end. As Monica spoke her decisive words, the atmosphere in the barbershop began to change. The silence that had previously been filled with fear and confusion was now filled with voices of support. The first to stand up was a middle-aged man who was watching everything with a confused face. His voice sounded loud and confident. "You're right, girl. We should support each other and fight against hatred." It was as if these words were a signal to the others. People who had been silent until then began to rise from their seats, voicing their support for Monica. "We will not be silent," exclaimed a woman with a short haircut, her eyes shining with determination. "We are all here to stand for the truth. Hate has no place in our community." Shouts of approval began to erupt among the audience, and soon many began nodding their heads in agreement. "You're not alone, Monica," added another customer, a young guy with brightly colored dreadlocks, who stepped closer. "We're all on your side. These people who scare us shouldn't stop us." His words sparked a new surge of approval and unity, and gradually the crowd began to coalesce into one powerful wave. The clients began to exchange glances, and there was determination in their eyes. They realized that this was not just one girl's fight, it was a battle for dignity, equality, and the rights of all who face bias. People began to rise to their feet, as if reclaiming their right to free speech and support. "Together we are stronger," exclaimed a woman Monica knew as a regular customer of the barbershop. "We can't let this type continue to sow hatred. We have to show that racism has no power over us." Monica felt her own courage strengthened by the support of those around her. She needed these words, these looks of understanding and solidarity. They helped her to realize that her struggle was not only her own struggle, but also the struggle of many who had experienced similar humiliation and pain. People began to form a circle around her, creating a protective wall against the aggressor. Each of them realized that by uniting, they could stand up to hate, and this unity became a powerful weapon. "We won't let you be bullied," the woman with the short haircut continued, her voice growing more and more confident. "We will stand together and protect each other. God forbid you think you can tell us who we are." The crowd gathered around began to chant words of encouragement, raising their hands in solidarity. Each voice became part of this new melody, symbolizing unity and support. Monica realized that together they could overcome any obstacle and make the world a better place. Victor, watching this new dynamic, felt his power melting before his eyes. Each new voice, each new note of support only strengthened the position of Monica and her defenders. His aggression didn't just lose meaning, it became insignificant in the face of this powerful wave of support. This support was not just verbal, it was an energy that moved people, uniting them in the fight for justice. Monica, feeling this powerful surge, knew that together they could stand up to hatred and show that unity and solidarity were of the utmost importance. Each of them had become part of her story, and in that unity lay the power to change everything. Victor, standing in the center of the barbershop, felt his confidence begin to crack at the seams. He was used to being the center of attention, but not like this. The moment the crowd began to express support for Monica, his emotional state changed dramatically. The loud laughter and shouts of approval that had previously seemed of little importance to him now sounded like a loud challenge to his authority, shattering his defense mechanisms. He noticed how people who had been silent only a few minutes ago were now raising their voices in defense of the girl. Panic flashed in Victor's eyes. His usual aggression, which had served as a weapon, was suddenly useless. He felt the pressure of stares and words full of condemnation bearing down on him. "What? Can you just shut up?" one woman said, and the question seemed to sound like a loud bell in his head. He tried to maintain his apparent control, but knew that confusion was building up inside him. "What's all this nonsense?" he muttered, though he realized it was only an attempt to drown out his own fears. Victor noticed how some of the customers had started recording what was happening on their phones, and that shattered his confidence even more. In his mind he was already thinking that his actions could have consequences he had never thought of. He looked around, and his gaze met with disgruntled faces. Everyone who had ever experienced his prejudice now looked at him with contempt and judgment. He felt his isolation intensifying. Suddenly, he was not the aggressor, but the outcast, and it was startling. "None of this is true," he muttered to himself, trying to convince himself that his actions were justified. But those words no longer had any power. Victor tried to regain control of the situation, but the words of encouragement that echoed around him were like waves, sweeping away his last vestiges of confidence. He began to realize that he could no longer cause fear. He was now the one who was experiencing it. Every time he tried to stir up a new conflict, He felt his voice shake and his inner fear turn into a deafening rage that he could no longer hide. Everything that had once been familiar to him now seemed unstable and shaky. He felt that he was alone among these people who had decided to turn against him. Every derogatory word he had uttered now turned against him, creating a kind of trap from which there was no escape. He realized that his aggression was just a mask, hiding a deep insecurity and fear of the real world. With each passing moment, he realized that his efforts to foment conflict were only pushing him away from others. Instead of subjugating those around him, he became the object of their contempt. This situation, where he seemed to be in complete control of everything, suddenly turned against him, and he stood paralyzed with fear, watching his power melt into thin air. Confusion overwhelmed him, and he didn't know how to get out of this situation. His attempts to intimidate and humiliate Monica, instead of giving him back his power, only made him worse. He felt the darkness thickening around him, and finally realized that the only opponent he truly feared was himself. When Victor felt his inner state eating up, he instinctively tried to find ways to justify his actions. The excitement that gripped him made him seek not only support, but also a way out of the situation in which he found himself. He could not afford to look weak in front of the crowd, and this thought encouraged him to speak even louder. "You just don't understand," he shouted, raising his hands in a helpless gesture. His voice sounded high and strained, as if he was trying to create a semblance of confidence that had long since left him. "I was joking. It's just a joke, and you're all taking it too personally." He looked at people as if seeking approval, but instead met only disgruntled looks. "You can't just react to simple words like that. I didn't mean to offend anyone. I was just giving my opinion," he added, but his words sounded like pathetic attempts to justify himself. He knew that excuse was as fragile as glass, and any new blow from the crowd could shatter it to pieces. Victor felt his own anger begin to rise again, and it only made his situation more difficult. "You're all being overly sensitive. It doesn't work that way. They're just words, and it's okay to say what you think," he continued, trying to convince not only those around him, but himself as well. He knew his actions were unacceptable, but he didn't want to admit it. Instead, he looked for fault in those around him, blaming them for not understanding him. The customers of the barbershop exchanged glances, and their eyes were filled with condemnation. They began to whisper, pointing out his behavior. "How can you say that?" said one of the women, to which the others nodded in agreement. This condemnation made Victor feel even more isolated, and he didn't seem to understand what exactly he had done wrong. "It's not like I was trying to hurt you, just saying what I think," he continued, his voice becoming more pleading but still rumbling. His attempts to appear right were turning into desperation. He looked for confirmation of his position, but instead only deepened his own confusion. He didn't realize that the real reason for his actions was deep fear and insecurity. His attempts to justify himself were looking more and more unconvincing by the minute. Everyone's so politically correct now. He slipped his lips, but there was no conviction in his voice. It was an inappropriate and insincere excuse, and silence fell around him again. Everyone in the crowd realized that his words hid only fear and weakness. The feeling that Victor was losing control was growing. It seemed to him that his excuses not only did not help, but also exposed his true self. What he tried to hide, this internal conflict, was aggravated by the increasing condemnation of others, and he could not find a way out of this vicious circle. "I just want everyone to live in peace," he finally said, and there was insincerity in his voice. It was a desperate and inappropriate statement that only confirmed his complete misunderstanding of the situation. Victor realized that he could not change the opinion of others, and the inner fear came upon him with a new force. He was alone, surrounded by disgruntled looks and whispers of condemnation. Each new moment plunged him into an abyss from which he could no longer escape, and his excuses only made the abyss worse. The inner turmoil he was experiencing was too deep, and he realized that his aggression would no longer work. It was obvious to him that this time he had lost not only his support, but also his dignity. The situation in the hairdresser's shop began to change dramatically, and this turning point was inevitable. Monica, feeling the support of those around her, felt her inner strength building up. Each new cry for support, each genuine smile from those around her boosted her confidence. She was no longer just a victim of the conflict, she was becoming a voice of resistance. At first she just stood there, clenching her fists, listening to Victor's lame attempts to justify himself. But as soon as he uttered another inappropriate excuse, something inside her snapped. In that moment, she realized that she could no longer allow this aggressor to delude herself into believing that his actions had no consequences. The support she felt inspired her to step forward and take control. Monica took a deep breath and looked at Victor and said, "Look, do you really not realize what you're doing? You're not just hurting me, you're humiliating everyone standing here." Her voice sounded confident and clear, as if a fire had been awakened in her that would not go away. The words she spoke were filled not only with resentment, but also with determination. The silence that had reigned around her was filled with tension. All eyes were once again fixed on her, and she could feel everyone present, eagerly waiting to see what she would say next. "You think you can come in here and say whatever you want without worrying about how it will affect the people around you? It's not just words, it's hate, and it needs to be fought." Monica took a step forward, moving closer to Victor, and in that moment she realized that she now had not only support, but a strength she hadn't felt before. She knew that her words could change not only this situation, but possibly someone present, forever. Victor, noticing her confidence, visibly began to fidget. His confidence and aggression began to dissolve under the pressure of her powerful performance. He hadn't expected the girl he was trying to humiliate to show such strength and resilience. It came as a shock to him. In his mind, she was just an object to be attacked, but now she stood before him as an opponent ready to fight. With every word she said, Victor felt his power and control over the situation slipping away. His attempts to justify himself and regain the initiative seemed increasingly irrelevant and powerless. Monica was not just responding to his insults. She was seizing the initiative and becoming a symbol of her own struggle against prejudice and hatred. "You have no idea how many people are hurt by people like you," she continued as she looked around the crowd, and everyone who listened felt her words penetrate their hearts. "We are tired of being silent. We are here to stand for the truth, and no one will turn a blind eye to your attacks." The customers of the hair salon began to raise their hands in agreement, supporting her words. At that moment, Monica realized that control was really shifting to her. She wasn't just speaking up for herself. She was speaking up for everyone who had ever faced bias. This was her time, and she was going to make the most of it. Gradually, the crowd began to rally around her, creating a strong wave of support that reinforced her words. "Now we are showing that hate has no power when we are together," she declared, and her voice filled with determination echoed throughout the barbershop. At that moment, Victor realized that his time was up. He was no longer the aggressor, whom everyone looked at with respect and fear. He had become an object of scorn and condemnation. Monica, on the other hand, went from being a victim to a powerful symbol of struggle. This turning point changed not only her, but also the whole dynamic of the conflict. She was now ready to go to the end to defend her dignity and the dignity of all those who had ever suffered from hatred. Victor stood in the center of the barbershop, his world crumbling before his eyes. Monica, until then just a customer, was now the embodiment of strength and confidence. Her words and the support of those around him were like a cold shower, and realizing that he had lost control, Victor felt panic rising inside him. He tried to gather his thoughts, but instead the words stuck in his throat. "Listen," he said, trying to regain his voice, which sounded weak and unsure. I didn't mean any harm. I just wasn't thinking." Every word he said sounded like a pathetic excuse, and he knew he sounded insincere, but in this moment, his insecurity was driving him to action. The crowd around him whispered perplexedly. Victor realized that their faces reflected condemnation and dissatisfaction. He kept talking, but it sounded more like mumbling than a real apology. I don't know why I said that. It was a mistake," he said, trying to explain his behavior in some way. His attempt to justify himself, however, elicited only chuckles from those standing around him. Everyone realized that his words were not sincere, that he was only trying to save face. Monica, standing in front of him with her head proudly raised, looked at him with contempt. It was clear in her eyes that she was not going to accept this lame apology. "A mistake," she exclaimed. "This is not just a mistake. You've shown hatred and aggression towards me and everyone here." Monica spoke loud and clear, and her words cut the air, exposing the entire failure of his excuses. "You thought you could assault people with impunity, and now that you see that's not true, you're trying to get away with it." Victor, feeling the pressure building up on him, tried again, I was in a bad mood. That's no excuse. But I don't want it to end like this. He stubbornly sought support again, but realized that there wasn't the sincerity in his words that would make a difference. His voice sounded quiet, and everyone around him could see that he was beginning to lose his self-respect. His gaze crossed with the eyes of one of the female customers, and he suddenly realized that it was her scornful look that reflected what he really was. I apologize, he said, lowering his head, and it sounded like he wasn't speaking to be forgiven, but rather to relieve himself of a load of guilt. I don't want this to become something more. But his apology was too late. The judgmental stares and whispers of the people around him left him alone, and he realized that his attempts to take a step back were too weak a move. Everyone had witnessed his humiliation, and it had created an insurmountable barrier between him and what he was trying to rebuild. Words won't rebuild what you've already destroyed, Monica said, and her words were infused with determination. You have to realize that behind every word you say, there are real feelings and real consequences. She took steps toward him. Her voice remained firm, and it seemed to make Victor sink deeper into confusion. Victor realized that his apology could not erase the mark he had left. In that moment, he became a symbol of what happens when hatred and prejudice go unpunished. I'm sorry, he said quietly, but it didn't matter anymore. His words, which once might have elicited forgiveness, were now only a reminder of how much he had lost himself in his own delusions. Monica, gathering her thoughts, looked at him with compassion, but her eyes were also full of determination. She knew that this moment wasn't enough to change him, but she also knew that she wasn't alone now. There were people standing around her, ready to support her in her fight against prejudice. Victor was alone, and the apologies he'd uttered had lost all their power in this new context, where hate couldn't defeat unity. The situation in the hairdresser shop was escalating to the extreme. Monica's shouts and accusations against Victor echoed, and everyone present began to realize that the conflict went beyond the usual misunderstandings. Alas, all this confusion made the employees of the establishment feel that they needed to intervene. The administrator of the hairdresser shop, a young woman named Anna, stood at the cash register and watched with growing concern. She realized that this conflict was not just an angry altercation. It could escalate into something more serious. A sense of responsibility was growing inside her, and it was clear to her that she could not ignore the situation. People were gathering around, and some of them had already begun to voice their grievances. We can't let this go on, she pronounced, turning to her co-worker who had just finished cutting a customer's hair. I'm calling security or the police. This isn't just a verbal altercation. Something worse could happen here. With these words, Anna headed for the phone. Trying to stay calm, she dialed the security number, trying to explain the situation, but her voice shook with worry. We have a conflict at the hair salon that could escalate into violence. We need an intervention, she said, and despite her effort to speak confidently, you could still hear the anxiety. At that moment, there were several customers standing behind her who had already started discussing what was going on. Anna could hear bits and pieces of their conversations, which made her even more determined. Someone has to stop this, they were saying, and each of them realized that the intervention of the police or security guards might be the only way to defuse the situation. As soon as she finished speaking, Anna stepped out from behind the counter and approached the group of people standing around Victor and Monica. Please stay where you are while we wait for security, she said in a subdued but firm voice. She looked at Victor, his face contorted with anger and embarrassment. We can't let this go on, she added, trying to look him straight in the eye to show him that she cared about her words. Monica, feeling supported by the administration, felt her inner strength strengthen again. This was not just an intervention that meant that those around her saw her not as a victim, but as a person who was standing up for her rights. And though she could see that Victor was nervous, his aggressiveness only emphasized the absurdity of the situation. Meanwhile, some customers began to whisper among themselves, encouraging each other to support the administration's decision. Right, let the guards deal with him, one woman said, and her words resonated in the hearts of many. Everyone realized that this situation needed to be addressed, and no one wanted to witness this nightmare any longer. The minutes dragged on, but soon a guard, a tall and muscular man in uniform, came through the door. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the barbershop. The tension that had been hanging in the air seemed to be defused, unappointed to the conflicting couple, and the guard quickly approached them, assessing the situation. "What's going on here?" he asked with authority, looking around the crowd. Seeing Monica, his attention focused on her and he nodded in support. "Don't worry, we'll handle the situation." Victor, feeling how all the responsibility now fell on him, suddenly realized that not only his words, but also his actions could lead to consequences. The guard crossed his arms over his chest and stood between him and Monica, creating an invisible wall. "I want you all to calm down and explain to me what happened," he said, and his voice sounded stern but fair. Thus, the intervention of the administration and the summoning of security guards played a decisive role in diffusing the situation. It was a reminder to everyone that no one should stand by when violence and humiliation are involved. Soon, the staff and guards became the basis for a safe atmosphere, and everyone present realized that they could unite and stand for the truth. The situation in the barbershop began to calm down as the security guard began to clarify the circumstances. His confidence and authority added calm to the tense atmosphere, and everyone in the room, though stressed, began to realize that this situation had a much deeper meaning than just a conflict between two people. The clients standing around began to exchange glances, and you could see the realization in their eyes. This was not just a scene from life, but an event that had touched their hearts and minds. Each of them was experiencing what was happening in their own way. Some felt anger about Victor, some felt sympathy for Monica, and some may have wondered how they would have acted in a similar situation. Anna, watching people's reactions, realized that this incident was an important lesson for everyone. In the hairdresser shop, where there was an atmosphere of calm and trust, questions about equality and respect suddenly arose. Everyone began to realize that their silence or indifference to such situations could have great consequences. When the guards started asking questions, there was silence in the hall. Each of the customers reflected on their own actions and reactions. Monica stood with her head up, proud and dignified, and her confidence was an inspiration to those around her. Soon, one of the men standing nearby spoke up. "We must realize that hate and bias are not just words. It is a real threat to all of us." His words elicited agreement and nods of approval from the crowd. People began to realize that this incident, which at first glance appeared to be only a conflict, was a reflection of a broader problem in the community. Each of them could witness similar behavior in the future, and it was important to understand what they could do to counter it. Other clients began to speak out, too. "We need to be more aware of what is happening around us," one woman remarked. "Each of us can find ourselves in the role of Monica or Victor, and it's important to remember how we can make a difference." Her words were a kind of summary for everyone present. They realized that silence and indifference only reinforce hatred and prejudice. The atmosphere in the barbershop was changing by the minute. People began to discuss how they could support each other and create a safer space free of hate and bias. This discussion was a revelation. Everyone came to realize that respect and fairness are core values that need to be protected and upheld in society. Monica, watching this transformation, felt that her courage and strength had had a real effect. Her struggle for dignity had not gone unnoticed, and she was now a symbol of change. "We all deserve respect, regardless of our color, gender, or background," she said, and her voice sounded confident and powerful. It was not only her personal experience, but the voice of everyone who has ever faced aggression and prejudice. With each new word spoken in that room, it was reaffirmed that respect is not something to be taken for granted. It is a value that must be actively defended. People left the barbershop realizing that each of them now had a responsibility to create a more just world. They left with a new understanding that fighting hate and prejudice is not just about standing up for yourself, but also about supporting others in their struggle. In this way, the incident in the barbershop became not only a source of fear and anger, but also the beginning of new relationships between clients, staff, and the entire community. Each of them came out of the ordeal with an awareness of their role in creating a hate-free space and a determination to work together to achieve this goal. When the whole tense situation finally came to an end, Monica felt a surge of strength and confidence boiling up inside her. The words and support of those around her were a real source of inspiration, and she realized that her struggle had not been in vain. Having reached such an important turning point, she realized that her dignity and courage deserved respect, not only from those around her, but also from herself. Gathering her thoughts, she stepped forward, glancing confidently at Victor, Despite his defeat and confusion, she felt neither hate nor anger. Instead, she realized that this situation was a lesson for everyone, including herself. Her passion and desire to be heard had overcome all obstacles, and now she could put what had happened behind her. Monica turned to the crowd, who were still standing in anticipation, as if unable to believe what had happened. "Thank you all for your support," she said, and her voice sounded clear and confident. "I know I'm not alone, and that gives me strength. Let's work together to create a society free of hate and bias." These words filled the air with energy, and people began to applaud, their eyes glowing with respect and admiration. As if to emphasize the significance of the moment, she raised her head even higher. Feeling pride filled her chest. Every step she took toward the exit of the hairdresser shop confirmed her inner strength. It wasn't just a physical movement, it was an expression that her dignity had been restored, and she wasn't going to let anyone violate it. As she passed Victor, his gaze was full of judgment and shame. He knew at that moment that he had lost not only the battle, but also the respect of those around him. In contrast, Monica walked with her head held high, and that was exactly what he couldn't understand, the strength of spirit that defied destruction. Fresh air greeted her outside, and as she took a deep breath, she felt a sense of freedom. Behind her was not just a hair salon, but a whole story of struggle and victory. Every person who was there became part of that moment, part of her victory. They witnessed that dignity and respect have a price, and that everyone has a right to a voice. She realized that there was still a lot of work to be done, and the problems that many people face still existed, but it was in that moment that she felt she could make a difference. With every step she took, she became a symbol of hope and change. As she walked past the crowd, her heart overflowed with pride for herself and those who supported her. She knew that victory was not always about defeating the enemy, but about being able to defend herself and the others. With her head held high, she went forward, ready to face whatever challenges still awaited her ahead. The end of the story was the beginning of something bigger. She realized that she, along with others, could continue to fight for respect and justice, turning each victory into a step toward a better world for all. Thank you for being with us throughout this story. We are very interested in hearing what you think about what you have just read. What do you think about the events described in this chapter? Have you had any instances of racism in your life? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. They are really important to us. Every single one of you matters, and we really appreciate your support. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like if you enjoyed this story. It will help us continue to create interesting content for you. Have a great day.